Hi, I'm Jason Buck from Mutiny Funds, and we're at this wonderful private event put on by the Collective in Nantucket. And it's my pleasure to sit down with Stephen Wilkinson from Good and Prosper. And I'm not sure if we have anything left to talk about because we talked for 7 hours yesterday, but I'm sure we can find some topics of
We were
discussion.
just getting warmed up.
Just getting warmed up. And yeah, I think it's you, me, and Grant Williams for a good 4 hours, and then you and I kept the conversation going. The place I actually want to start that it kind of jumped out at me initially is like I'm fascinated by naming conventions with businesses. Like I've had a lot of businesses as an entrepreneur, as you have as well. And I'm always thinking of like business names and what encapsulates what we do. Like the Musashi, like how you do one thing is how you do all things. And usually you come up with a great business name and then you find out it's taken, right? And so Good and Prosper, why did you choose Good and Prosper? And like, what does that mean to you?
Well, firstly, it's a play on words, and I am obsessed with plays on words. And secondly, it's a neat encapsulation of my philosophy around business. So the number of times that I've had conversations in the last, I don't know, 20, 25 years with people who think that the only way to be successful in business is if you somehow check in your ethics in the cloakroom and then enter the hall, and then you can do business, and you have to do that to be successful. And my deepest conviction is that is. Am I allowed to use the word bullshit? Is
Yeah,
that an American word?
use any
Yeah.
word you want.
Yeah. my my deep conviction is that that's nonsense, and that the only real way to be successful in business is to be as to be ethically good, good in terms of serving other people, serving customers, serving your employees, serving your suppliers, serving your ecosystem, serving your product, serving that sense of service, which is what we are called to do in a good ethical environment, that is the key to success. So, and to prosperity. And prosperity, I define prosperity as as a confluence of healthy mind and body, healthy relationships, and work that is enjoyable, and that profit, money, material rewards flow as a consequence of doing those, concentrating on those things. So this idea of good in the sense of an ethically responsible and prosperity have joined at the hip for me in business.
Where do you think that like stereotype came from? Like I know you'll probably tell me exactly where the quote comes from because like, I can't remember the attribution of like all great wealth comes from like a great crime. Like I would always hear that when I was traveling around South America and those sorts of things. But it seems like an antiquated idea, or is it people not in business that think that business people have to be unethical to have prosperity?
That's one of those memes that sound great, but is actually rubbish. If you look at, which crime did Steve Jobs commit when he started making? Which crime did Bill Gates commit? Which crime did Les Schwab commit? Which crime did Warren? And none, they didn't. It's nonsense. I think it comes from it has a different origin, and my sense is that it was originally referred to the aristocratic families.
Mm.
That every aristocratic lineage is rooted in bloodshed. So you got to be an aristocrat if you killed a lot of people in the name of your king or saved something, or so that was where I think it originally came from, and it's just become a meme. It doesn't. It's not.
Is it Proust or like what am I missing?
No,
Is because it's older than that because it's interesting the aristocratic families because I thought I remember it's like robber barons or something, but it
it goes way
completely even
goes
before
way
that because yeah in modern times you don't require that like but in yeah if you went back to aristocratic families that might require some bloodshed or some sort of
Yeah,
nefarious
because
means.
most aristocrats, most aristocratic lineages, old ones, were based on prowess on the battlefield. You served your king, and if you were brave in war or in a battle, and you saved the day or you routed the enemy, then your reward for your bravery would be a castle in Wales or something. I don't know, and land, and that's how the king rewarded his most loyal subjects. And so, in an incentives, in a world that then as now is entirely dependent on incentive structures, the bloodthirstiest most psychopathic warriors, got the titles, and then they had to fight to keep the land, so you had to remain a little bit psychopathic.
Mm.
And then eventually, a few hundred years later, you were refined and you forgot about that.
It's so funny, actually. It makes me think about like those contradictions. Is like, as we talked about the other day, I lived in Napa Valley for a long time, and I would call it like surname laundering. So like people would have these great businesses like in the Midwest in like canning or construction or something like that. And for some reason, they wouldn't think that was good enough. So then they'd take their wealth, move to Napa Valley, and they'd start a winery. So then their kids could be like this landed gentry or patrician
Yeah, of
class.
course.
And so that's what I was saying, surname laundering. But I was like, no, the thing you were doing before was the great thing, not this winery. But it's just interesting of why we.
Yeah, well, the Astors, he slaughtered beavers, um, for and built his fortune trading beaver fur, killing them and skinning them and bringing them back to New York all cleaned up. And there's I find, because I grew up in Europe, and Europe still has a very much an aristocratic culture, and it's still very much society is still organized in some countries, certainly the UK, certainly Italy, possibly Austria, Germany not so much, although it actually still is under the surface, where there's deference to the aristocratic elite. And I've found that there's that in business, those are two different business models.
Mm.
So the aristocratic business model is based on things never changing, and all of the symbols of aristocracy, the old house, the old land, the 200-year-old vineyards, the 300-year-old private bank, the agriculture, all of these, the forests
Mm.
that they've been there for 500 years or whatever. There's something. It's an entirely different business model. And what I find interesting is that people who are successful in a business model that requires them to be constantly vigilant around change and adaptability should choose to negate exactly the things that actually made them successful and want to project this image of permanence and non-change. So when successful businessmen, and particularly in my UK experience, when they start buying sort of country estates
Right.
and putting flat caps on and doing country pursuits, what they are effectively saying is to all the people in their own family, forget what made us successful, because now we've made it, and you're effectively damning them not to learn how to perpetuate the wealth, because they suddenly then find that distasteful
Right.
for the reasons that you mentioned. And in America, it's Napa Valley vineyards,
Yeah.
and in Europe and in the UK, it's country estates.
The other way I've looked at it is like I've seen like when you said they take the country estate or the vineyard, and then they start talking to the next generation or whatever talks about they don't want to be social climbing or they don't want to seem hustle culture or work hard. It's like, but somebody in your lineage did that for you to live that way, and then because again it goes out through the kids, the grandkids, and then eventually it cycles back and they lose all of it because none of them want to get back to that because
Yeah,
like you
and they
said they're
can't,
not teaching them how to do
and they
it.
can't.
Yeah, and they can't.
They've been either directly or indirectly inculcated in the belief that that is somehow beneath their dignity.
It's like veal or something, right? Like they're milk fed veal, like they don't even work out anymore. They just get massaged every day and drink milk or something. Like, there's
Like veal, I
yeah.
had not thought of that. And
That was just I don't know where that came from in my mind, but related to that, one of the questions we had at the in part of the collective group the other day was like, has America lost its way or lost its lead? You talked about monopoly, those sorts of things. But when you're just saying that, I had another conversation where I was wondering, is the American dream, it's a Rorschach blot for everybody. Nobody has a true definition. It's like a feeling what the American dream is. But like you're saying, the aristocratic model in Europe, looking from a European lens or a UK lens, do you think part of that American dream is the upward mobility throughout social classes is more prevalent in America than any other place in the
yeah,
world?
absolutely.
Do you think that's still the case, looking at from the outside in?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the questions I wanted to ask in the collective roundtable that we had yesterday, just as a matter of interest, is who had blue collar, even poor fathers or grandfathers?
Hmm.
So within that immediate generational structure of grandfather, father, and son. And my sense was that there was the distance between, or the people around the table had come a long, long way from where their parents were, or possibly even their grandparents. I think was it Rob who said his granddad was a coal miner?
Hmm.
Um, and and Doomberg, who said they came from very working class background.
And we both have a love language. Doombert said, "I desperately want to go from labor to capital,"
Capital.
and I love that. I'm going to steal that line for sure. Hopefully, I'll attribute him for a little while, but then I'll take it on as
Yeah,
my own.
absolutely.
Of course.
Yeah. And that was something that he said, and I don't, because he uses that phrase a lot in
Mm.
conversation. Um, that his uncle had told him. He said, "You can't stay here. If you stay here, you'll just be labor. So you need to go to the US, and then you've got a chance at being capital." And it's an interesting distinction.
So, do you think that people in Europe or the UK, if you're preternaturally driven towards entrepreneurship or business, it's more of a quote unquote American mindset, and do you have an advantage in an environment that's more of the
Yes,
aristocratic model?
I do.
Or is it headwinds or tailwinds, or is it just a little bit of both? And so
How do you mean headwind or tailwind?
well, because you're fighting that aristocratic model and the whole tall poppy syndrome that you should get knocked down, and no, there's not a lot of like-minded people like you. So it gives you an advantage to being different, but being different sometimes is also a headwind.
Right. I think it's more difficult in Europe, but the UK is slightly different. The UK isn't Europe anymore. Well, it's on the European continent, but it's not. It's a different mindset. It's that there's a difference between what I would call the Roman Catholic European mercantilist system, which is very top down in the way it perceives the relationship between the state and the individual, state first, individual second. And in the UK, we still have, in theory, the other way around. It's still the primacy of the individual over the state. Still, I mean, technically, I think all the larger federal governments get, whether
Hmm.
that's in Westminster or in Berlin, or it doesn't matter where it is, or in Paris, the larger they get, the less that is true. But I think we're coming to the natural end of that expansiveness of the state because we know where it ends.
Hmm. I wanted to come back to the ethics in business and like you can do good and prosper. It's like the nomenclature and the acronyms change and like a few years ago it was ESG, environmental social governance, right? And that's what everybody was talking about. But it never made sense to me in the sense of like that's just good business. If I'm a good business person, I have to take those into account and that will give me a profitable business. So that it was another way of saying the dichotomy was like we want to push businesses towards ESG and I'm like a good business person is thinking about that all the time
Well,
anyway.
yeah, well, the ESG is a typical example of what happens when responsibility is carved out of property, because all property comes with responsibility, all of it, every everything, every material thing, whether it's a house or a car or a business or a more complex set of assets, everything is only exists in a social context. And if you own property, you have a responsibility. You've got the privilege of ownership and the fruits of it, the usufruct of your property, and you have responsibility for it. You have responsibility to the thing itself, and you have responsibility to it in its social context. And what we have seen over the past probably 50, 60 years, I'm not going to put a date on it, but the
Hmm.
post-war period, is a gradual stripping away of this idea that you have any responsibility.
Hmm.
Your only responsibility is to yourself. And when you start taking ownership responsibility away from ownership, then, because nature abhors a vacuum, the state comes in and legislates responsibility, and it does it in a very clumsy way. And it tries to, because what else is it going to do? It tries to codify that responsibility. So ESG, environmental social governance, is just a very clumsy way of codifying the responsibility that the owner of a thing has, in this case business, or the owners of a business have, to ensure maximum longevity and balance within the ecosystem of the business itself. So businesses are living things. They exist purely out of human energy, and they therefore interact with the natural environment. They have an ecosystem of their own made up of relationships, and they have a sense of stewardship that needs to look after the competing interests of all those various constituents within the ecosystem. So that's where you get your E, your S, and your G. And of course it's clumsy, and of course it's been misappropriated for other more nefarious purposes. We know that there is a way of thinking about the world that was rooted in the disaster of the Second World War, in which a group of intelligent, well-meaning, passionate, technocratically schooled individuals formulated this idea of that we needed to get rid of the nation state because nation states are inherently conflict ridden with other nation states that leads to war, and that we need a global government. We need to get rid of the structures of a nation state, and pretty much the entire arc of post-war governance political thinking has been deeply influenced by that conviction that nation states are dangerous, that democracy is dangerous because people are too stupid to understand what they're doing. This is the perspective of the technocrats. And ESG is just one of the many instruments that they've developed to effect sort of global standards and global governance and global management of the system. And it, of course, defies human nature, and it goes against the grain of people's own cultural identity and their heritage, because they are, we are local first. And so these well-meaning, intellectually well thought out theoretical papers that end in things like ESG actually are weeds that suffocate the life out of business.
So,
But they have their roots in the fact that we don't take responsibility.
So that's what I was thinking. Like, if you didn't take responsibility for that property in your ecosystem and nurturing your business, I would be like, you just lose your business. But what you're saying, instead of losing your business, you just gained a partner from the government, and maybe the new managerial class is now the government manager. Like, and so now so it's not necessarily losing, but maybe losing freedom and control and losing the.
Yeah, you are.
Because if you're not responsible for it, somebody else will be, and now you have a global.
Because you cannot have
Hmm.
you cannot have a responsibility vacuum that will be filled. You can't divorce ownership from responsibility and not expect somebody to take that over, and it will always be the collective. It was always been the collectivist system that will take that responsibility on if you're not doing it yourself.
It's better because we also talked about individualism versus collectivism, so it's making me think about that. One of the other things you and I randomly talked about the other day on our walk to the lighthouse, which was probably the best part, is being able to see the sea, as we both have a deep love for the ocean, is I was talking about, we're talking about atheism defining themselves by being anti-God. So almost related to ESG, we also talked about David Sender and his founders podcast, and how much we enjoy that as well. But with this kind of new framework has come out, is like these anti-business billionaires or these anti-business businessmen, whether that's Yvon Chouinard at Patagonia, or some people would say they like the aesthetics of Steve Jobs or James Dyson. But once again, if we're saying that's anti-business to care about things, like, that's the wrong framework, right? That's business.
I think that's entirely the wrong framework. It's entirely the wrong framework, and it shows a paucity of understanding of what business is. If you take the Milton Friedman, the business of business is business, which means nothing, or the business of the exclusive purpose of business is to increase shareholder value, which also means nothing, because unless you put a time frame on that, is it in the next 24 hours? Is it the next week? Is it the next half a year? Or is it over an undefined period, which could be forever? my answer to that will be as long as possible. Every business has an evolutionary purpose sort of embedded in it, and the job of ownership and stewardship and management is to just let the business find its evolutionary path and not get in the way of it. But that comes very much down to this idea of business as a living organism and not a machine. It's not an input-output box where you can optimize the inputs and the processes through which they are transformed into outputs, and then you can grow it, you can put more money in, make the box bigger. That is a very naive way of thinking of business, and it's one that unfortunately it determines how we think of economics, macro and micro, and it's nonsense because economics is a social science or a social investigation and not a mechanical one. And this idea that that successful people with a business are somehow anti-business, and that anti-business, that's just stupid. I mean, it's literally stupid. I mean, because it supposes that the only way to do business properly is on that Milton Friedman basis of it's only there to generate profits, which is patently wrong.
Mm. And then assuming the fringes are, these people can operate the fringes because that's another way businesses run, which is not true either. And like, if I was going to be charitable to the Milton Friedman of like increasing shareholder value, is it once again maybe a misinterpretation or misunderstanding of shareholder value? Maybe if we change the name to stakeholders, and
No,
the stake
I definitely wouldn't do that.
no, but what if the stakeholders are our employees, our suppliers, the environment around, like our family, like so it changing that's how you increase.
Once you start legislating for this, once you start separating ownership from responsibility, then you get into this idea that, well, actually everybody's got a stake and everybody should have a say and everybody should, and that's stakeholder capitalism. And I think it's nonsense. It's really dangerous because that it's not because the owner's job is to ignore them. It isn't. But the real skill is integrating all of those various different constituents as an owner. And if you don't, if you ignore your responsibility to them, you will not have as good or as prosperous a business as you could have if you did. But it's very much an individual choice and an individual, and it has to be, because once you start legislating into it, then as let's say in Germany, if I look at Germany, Germany has a very highly codified sort of worker participation in the governance, and the workers have workers' councils and they sit on the boards, and what it does is it removes the need for the owners to do that thinking, because they say, well, it's not our
No.
business, that's the workers' council, they can deal with that. And I think that is, you get where it comes from. I mean, you can understand why people would legislate, why that legislation came out. But it atrophies the business. It's not, and at the end of the day, when there's a crisis, you do what you have to do, and they do what they have to do, and so at the very, when push comes to shove, it's the owners of the business who are determining what happens. And yes, they have to do it with the workers. They have to do it, but you have to do that anyway. You have to talk to your suppliers. You have to talk to your workforce. You have to talk to your customers. That's your job. It's your jobs, management's jobs, owners' jobs. And once you start delegating it or creating the institutionalized systems that take that responsibility away from me, it weakens the system. It doesn't strengthen it.
That's what you perfectly led me there. Almost like it's more complex nuance, and it's like almost dichotomies clashing. It's like you need almost a dictatorship to run the business, but they're a good business is taking into consideration those stakeholders, but still leading them in a way. Or another way I'd think about it, it brought to mind for me is like I remember during COVID, I saw a lot of business owners that were just kind of sharing everything with their employees, and I thought that was a complete lack of leadership. Like, because a lot of times you're scaring your employees, like showing them all of the finances and everything. You can share, it's good to share some things, but it's also somebody has to, steady the ship and lead the course where they're almost like trying to diffuse their responsibility across their employees. And I thought that was an extreme, like they thought it was extreme transparency with their employees, and I felt like it's an extreme lack of leadership in a way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I'm a strong proponent of open book management.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not something that you can do without investing the time and resources to genuinely educate people.
And that's what they did. They went open book without giving them the financial education to
If
understand
you
that.
don't do that, that's a
Right.
disaster. I mean, I have a friend who runs a business in Chicago, and he and his brother have been doing this for, I don't know, 40 years. And about 20 years ago, they decided to go open book. And one of the first things that they did was they had a town hall meeting for all the employees, and they asked them 3 questions. How much revenue do you think we do? How much profit do you think we make? And how much money do you think my brother and I take out of the business? And then they would collect. There was about 100 employees, maybe 120, and they collected all the data and they put it into a spreadsheet, and then they had the graphs for pretty quickly. And it said it was hilarious. It was absolutely hilarious on the one hand and frightening on the other. So at the time they were doing about 8 million in revenue, so quite a small business. And the range of outcomes were quite tight. So it was somewhere between 6 and 12 is what people guessed. So 8 was sort of in the middle, and that was fair enough. But profit and what they took home, I mean, there were a number, not just 1 or 2, a significant number who showed that the profit was more than the revenue that they had, that they
Put down.
put down, and what the business owners took out was more than that as well. And so what they learned from that was that there's no understanding. So people think that if you own a business, you're automatically taking home $1 million a week or something.
Yeah.
And that just sort of goes with the territory. And that there was very, very little understanding of how those things happen. And Tom said to me, he said, well, when he revealed the truth, he said, okay, we're doing 8 million revenue. We're working on an 8% profit margin. And my brother and I keep everything in the business. We have a salary of 120,000. And there was absolute stunned silence. Stunned silence. Until one guy put his hand up and said, Tom, why the fuck do you do it? And he said, well, that's a really good question. Yeah. And I said, I'll tell you why we do it, because I think in 5 years' time, we'll be doing 35 million. And we're probably we have a profit margin of maybe 12 to 15%. And then all the for 10, 15 years that we've been building this business up, that will start paying dividends, and then we can take profit out because we don't need to put everything back in the business again. But, it's a cyclical business, and we'll probably keep the largest part of it in cash or reserves of some because, if we have a downswing for a year or two, I want to be able to keep you all up. And that was the beginning of a very powerful conversation within the business. But he said it was, on the one hand, he was laughing, and the other hand, crying at the sheer lack of understanding and this idea that, just owning a business automatically qualifies you for at least $1 million a year in
Untold riches. Yeah.
in riches. And the truth is exactly the opposite. I don't know whether you ever come across the writer Mike Michalowicz. He wrote a book called Profit First, which is
Yes.
a great book, very valuable primer for business owners. And he talks about, that his mission is to alleviate what he calls entrepreneurial poverty,
Right.
which is this idea that the concept that people running businesses are effectively slaves to their own businesses, working on a dollars per hour basis, way under the minimum wage, with massive responsibilities at considerable cost to their health, their mental health, their relationships, their quality of life, and they're taking home maybe 40, maybe 50,000 on average. That's ludicrous. I'm working, 80, 90 hours a week. And because there's very little financial discipline, because they don't understand margins, they don't understand focus and strategy and all the things that are important to building a good business. But that's terrifying. And people have no idea that there is even such a thing as entrepreneurial poverty.
Right. Well, that's the favorite example of like from that book, like especially in America, yeah, like the average entrepreneur is only making 40 to 50 grand.
Yeah.
But everybody thinks they're not going to be average, right? That's the problem. But like you're likely to hit that average and
What's your word? Your favorite word? Hyper
hypomania.
hypomania.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Irrational
It's
irrational
this
optimism.
irrational belief that you are going to, your experience of entrepreneurship is going to be within that sort of 5% outlier.
Right.
And my belief is there are very clear ways of improving the odds significantly that you are going to be within those 5%. Focus is one of them. Having a very clearly articulated idea of whose problem you're solving, which comes back to this idea of service. Who am I serving? If I think about everything that I do in terms of service, well, then I need to be very clear who I'm serving and what problem that am I solving for them. And if the more clarity I have, the more focus I have, and my belief is that you get paid in 3 different ways in business. You get paid in money as measured in gross margin. So in other words, what is my customer prepared to pay over and above the cost of assembling whatever it is that I'm doing, whether it's a service or a good? What are the input materials that I'm assembling, and what's the margin that he's prepared to pay over and above the input costs of that, labor and materials? And the higher the margin, the more evidently the thing that I'm creating is valued.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the one way. Second way is knowledge. So if I'm focusing on solving a problem and I'm very specific about the problem that I'm solving, every time I get to do it, I'm improving my knowledge in a compound way of not only the problem itself, but the context in which that problem exists. So I get pattern recognition, I get process optimization, I get an understanding of the other things that are also likely to be true if that problem is in existence. And so the more, and that compounds. The more I do it, the better I get at it. It's like practicing the piano. If you do it for 4, 5, 6 hours a day, over a year, 2 years, 3 years, eventually I become very proficient. And the third way you get paid is reputation. And those 3 elements of business pay are not only compounding in and of themselves, they are also mutually reinforcing. So the more I get to do something, so the better my reputation, the more I get to do something, the more I get to do something, the better I get. Better I get, the higher my reputation, the more I can charge for it, and so on. So I can create a virtuous cycle of compounding of knowledge, reputation, and gross margin that allows me to thrive, but only if my attitude is one of service. The moment that I stop and I start just harvesting, then I'm starting, the entropy sets in and I start moving backwards. And so you can significantly improve the odds of winning in business. And if you're prepared to give up what you're doing because it doesn't fit actually any of the focus definitions of solving a real problem. So you get a lot of people who do what they do in business because that's what they do. They've never asked the question, does anybody need it? Who needs it? How would I have to change it slightly in order to meet a real need? So they go into a market with a fairly blunt instrument rather than a nail. They're going in with a block, and they wonder why they're getting so much resistance. And as I say, there's that entrepreneurial poverty is mostly a result of lack of focus and lack of financial discipline.
Well, like, there's couple of things in there. One is like with the the idea like Bruce is like sometimes now like pursue your passion or whatever. It's like no, do something like you're saying the education, like to me is like when you deep dive in something and you keep learning about it, you keep iterating. The more you do it and you become a master, that's where the passion comes and the
I believe that
reputation
to be
comes,
true.
right?
I believe that the thing that creates the most passion is earning a really good living by doing something that is useful to somebody else.
Competence and service here, right?
Right. That's where it comes from. Starting with passion is really dangerous because you're then basically on a missionary exercise to convert people to your way of thinking. And that's always a dangerous thing in business.
The other thing that it brought up for me is a lot of people these days are talking about the silver tsunami and they want to take over all of these boomer businesses and figure out some sort of legacy there. But what I find is everybody's just talking about the gross margin and the multiples. And I couldn't care less about that. What's really sad to me is the knowledge and the reputation. This person that's like 65 or 70, they're just truly hitting their stride of compounding on knowledge and reputation, and they're about to give that all up. And the next person has to start that cycle all over. And it kind of like in a family business, maybe you have that legacy, right? But everybody's focused on the gross margin and the multiple, and that's how they just want to buy at a low multiple and everything. I don't care about the gross margin side. I care about the reputation and the knowledge side because then you can figure out your gross margin on that. But it's fascinating to me. People are only focused on one stool of that tripod that you're talking about.
Right. Well, you mean one leg of the tripod. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is true, and that is because a lot of people coming into business only know it from the spreadsheet side. For them, business is just a model. And I think I told you this, that I spend a lot of time in restructuring businesses. My eldest son said to me a couple of years ago, he said, Dad, you're so much happier now that you're not dealing with broken businesses. And that is absolutely true. I think there comes a point where you just that gets to you. However, one of the things that if you're buying a broken business, one that's gone into Chapter 11 or insolvency or is close to it, the numbers are fairly useless because there are real things happening underneath the numbers. So, for instance, most businesses, particularly manufacturing businesses, and particularly if you're a downstream component manufacturer, and there's a change of ownership happening, you will see a boost in revenue in the first month or two after you've taken over, and that's a bear trap, because what's happening is that your supply, the people that you're supplying, they're looking at new management, people they don't know, and they're putting in extra orders while they look for a new source. So you think, oh look, I've taken over the business.
Yeah.
We're getting all this extra business in. What they're doing is they're filling their stock because actually they're about to cancel or downgrade you as a supplier because they no longer know or have trust in the individuals because they've never heard them before. You get some private equity restructuring business coming in and they say quality is going to go down. They're going to start saving. They're going to start wanting to negotiate new prices with us. We're going to go to a second source. And that second source is then built up. And in the interim period, we'll just do more business with them because they won't do that immediately. And it's really dangerous, and your best salespeople will probably have left. And so distinguishing between false momentum and real momentum, that can kill you. So if you've paid on the basis of, I don't know, steady state, and then you get the surge in the first quarter of your taking over and you think you're a genius, and then 6 months later, half of your business has disappeared, that can be, but you need, and the numbers don't tell you that. They just don't, they will never tell you that story.
Tell you the opposite. Like you think you're doing fine that quarter, but you're not seeing the longer term vision of
Absolutely.
the cliff ahead.
Yeah, you're not seeing the cliff, or you're not seeing how the relationship part of that, which is to do with reputation, how that's rapidly deteriorating, much faster than the actual numbers themselves. And if you're not aware of that, your spreadsheet's not going to tell you that. That will you'll only
They'll tell you the opposite. Tell you you're doing great. Meanwhile, your reputation, like they're using you as a Tarzan swing, and they're about to leave you behind.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are hundreds of examples
Right.
of that in business, and that's why you need to have experience, which is this idea of constantly doing something over and over again. The compound returns to knowledge are huge. If you focus and you're doing the same thing, if you're doing a different thing every week or every year, then you get no compounding.
I remember it was like a few years ago, I got really interested in corporate restructuring and turnarounds. I'm trying to remember some of the books, like was like Corporate Turnaround Artistry and all this stuff. And I remember reading all that, and I was like, this is an unbelievably stressful way to live, like your son said to you. But I was actually reading it to find out like how do businesses go wrong and get back, so I don't even get there. Like how do you run a great business? Like it's almost like Munger inversion, right? Like to me, it was a way of like
Yeah.
looking at those to think, how do I not get to that
Yeah.
situation? So it was an interesting part of that. But I want to go back to like your Chicago example because I find like the good things are really in like the contradictions or the dichotomies. And so when you talked about profit first, profit first is about not deluding yourself an entrepreneur that I just keep reinvesting in the business, keep reinvesting. I'm living in poverty, and then one day I'll experience these riches. But then when you're talking about the Chicago business, that's essentially what they're saying is like they're saying I believe in 5 years we'll be at 35 million. Instead of paying myself 125,000, I'll reap those rewards later. So explain to me like the nuance of how do you get there?
Well, you can't harvest what's not there yet.
Well, that's part of it too.
The single most powerful determinant of success is time preference. It's that simple. If if I can forego, if I start my business on day one and order my Ferrari on day two, then you may not make it to day three. You can do it.
Yeah.
And a lot of people do because they think, well, now I'm a business, now I'm an entrepreneur. I need to have the things that entrepreneurs have rather than doing the things that successful entrepreneurs do, which is not buy the Ferrari and or not yet,
Right.
and doing it when it's irrelevant in terms of your overall cash flow.
That's why the profit first is kind of hard concept because like you can't harvest what's not there.
Right, but what you can do is install a discipline. It's a little bit like, I don't know, doing gym work.
Mm.
Um, I had this great story once from, I don't know who it was. There's a guy called Michael Hyatt who who I was listening to in sort of 2015. He's one of the first sort of podcasters and bloggers, and he did a sort of good job of as a sort of elder statesman talking about good habits in business, and he tells the story of a of a woman that he was coaching, and he sort of he drew a lesson from this, that he asked her whether she had a sort of running regime, sort of an exercise regime, and she had set herself a goal of running, I don't know, 10, 15 miles a week. And she was not hitting it. And he said, well, why don't you just run a mile? And she said, I can't possibly do that. That's stupid. Why would I run a mile? He said, well, you're not running 5. You're not even running 1. And in her head, running 1 was a waste of time because who runs just a mile? I mean, that's just silly. You may as well not bother. And his point was, well, there's no point in setting goals that you don't obtain and then poo-pooing lesser goals that you could but don't because they're not worth it. And this idea of starting small and building a habit that can get you from running a mile to running to 1.5 to 2 to 5, and it goes quite quickly because it's actually not the running that's the issue, it's the making time to do it that's the issue, and building it into your routine. So Mike Michalowicz's, I think, unprecedented service to business is telling them, do this right from the beginning. And even if you're only taking 1% profit,
Right.
everybody can put, from every dollar of revenue that you can get in, you can put out a cent
Right.
into
The
a separate
habit.
account. Of course you can. And you just run the business on the 99 cents that are left. And when you've got that habit, what happens is that 1 cent just becomes silly. So you take 2, and then you're at 5, and then you're at 10. And now you're actually making money. You're running the business on the residual of what is left after you've taken the profit. And because most people don't, they never build the profit habit. They don't exercise the profit muscle.
It's just inverting the pyramid to pay yourself first, even if the minus the amount
Absolutely.
that it builds the habit over time
Yeah,
instead of
of
you
course
at
it
the bottom
does.
of the pyramid, it's the
Of
top of
course
the
it
pyramid.
does. And it's
I
and I think Mike Michalowicz has done incomparable service to the entrepreneurial community by just pointing that out.
Yeah.
Just pointing it and just do it. And most entrepreneurs who are living in entrepreneurial poverty, they they don't have a system for success. They hope that their idea of the entrepreneurial journey is suffer, 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 exponential jump, yacht, 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 yacht.
Then you find other, yeah, the Ferrari. Like, so I think I know you're well aware of like how recently popular like atomic habits have become and everything, but almost to your point, like, yeah, like having this large goal that you never achieve because it's so burdensome is the way I've always had like a workout regime is I had to convince myself every day I just had to do like one pull-up, right? So you can't argue with yourself against doing one pull-up, but I know if
I
I
can.
go, well, if I go over and do one pull-up, inevitably if I grab that bar, I'm just going to go for more than one pull-up. And so then I at least get that in every day, right? And then the next day I'm like, all you have to do is one push-up, right? But if I get down on the floor to do a push-up, I'm gonna do like a max set of push-ups or one squat. And it's amazing because of that habit, I would never miss a day for like 10 years, even if I was sick, because it's not that burdensome, but it builds
Yeah.
that habit and that
Well,
compounds over time.
to start with, one isn't burdensome, but once your muscles get in shape,
Right,
20 isn't burdensome
right,
or 50 isn't
right.
burdensome. And so you're constantly looking, well, when does it become burdensome? And then you stop just before that.
And even better, I didn't have to put on synthetic workout gear or any of that disgusting stuff. I could work out like a gentleman.
Right. Well, gentlemen don't work out,
But that's so sick.
but
Or this sauna is the gentleman's workout. But also going back to the Chicago example, um, because I want to show like we're saying, you can be good and have prosperity, but it's not all sunshine drops and lollipops. There's a lot of things there that we talked about the other day with Machiavelli and being a dictator, but maybe a benevolent dictator is like in that example, and they see that the owners of the business are only like, say, taking home 125,000 a year, right? But they know in that 5 years they're going to take out a lot more. They can go, wow, in that time frame, they understand those sacrifices. But 5 years hence, and they start seeing that profit in the open book, like how are you educating employees to not, people change, behaviors change, and people are, what have you done for me lately? You see, I'm kind of
yeah,
asking
absolutely.
it's
Well,
like,
I have an answer for that too. And I think that the capitalist system at its most effective teaches employees how to think like capitalists and gives them a stake in their own performance. So I'm a huge admirer of Ken Iverson. He wasn't the founder of Nucor, but he bought Nucor in the 1960s in a deal where the what then became Nucor, the small steel mill, was one of a sort of bag of assets that he bought, and everybody told him get rid of the steel plant immediately because the general opinion was nobody is ever going to make any money in making steel in America anymore. It's just not going to work, and unions and legacy and cost of labor, and it's just not energy costs. It's just you can't compete with India, or this was before Mittal. But people saw Bethlehem Steel and they saw how they were losing money pretty much every year. Um, and he kept that business, and his model was superb. He really understood what he was paying his employees for in terms of required productivity. I mean, he not only kept Nucor as the least hierarchical business in America. I think there were only 2 layers between the shop floor and him ever during his lifetime, no matter how big the company got. Um, but he also developed a system in which the the required minimum productivity in each factory and therefore from each team was clearly calculated and communicated, and anything over that minimum productivity, that required productivity, which effectively um, incorporated the total cost of running that particular plant, depreciation and so on, that anything over that was shared with the workers. So they had massive incentives to become really creative around their own productivity, and it paid out in spades. Not only was Nucor phenomenally successful, and still is. I mean, it's now, I think when he took it over, it was I don't know, 20, $30 million business. And it's now a $50 billion business, 50, 60 years later. Um, I think he died in 2012, something like that. But his legacy is just extraordinary. And I studied him and his methods. And for me, that's how to do capitalism. You calculate hard in terms of your required productivity to meet your cost of capital and your depreciation on your fixed assets. You calculate your labor costs as a function of that, to the minimum required productivity, and then you share in productivity gains over and above that. And that's an amazing incentive structure. It's an amazing incentive structure. And the new core employees were the best paid steel workers in the world by factors, not margins, factors. And that's how to do it. There's no question in my mind that if you do that, if you're very clear about what your minimum requirement is, what am I paying somebody $85,000 a year for? What productivity contribution are they carrying? And if they do better than that in their team, well, then they should share in the rewards.
And with the financial education, so they understand what all that means as
They've
well. And then, but like we brought up Mondragons yesterday too. Like, there's nothing that can be though formulaic, but is there an intuition pump you think though of what that owner or CEO gains in the percentage of those? Like, you know, like Mondragons will cap like the CEO of 9x the lowest average employee wage, or like how do you think about the cascade of those distributions and maybe the founder or owner? Is there a way, like how do you think what's is there fair, like how do you determine what's fair in that
well,
scenario
firstly,
for the
um,
risk taken and the
firstly, every entrepreneur should be focused on producing intrinsic value and capital gains of their holding, and not maximizing their income, because it doesn't make sense
right?
from a tax perspective. And once you've let's say you've managed to get to a place where your average employee is earning $60,000 in fixed salary and another 60 in productivity share, just say for the sake of argument, and you take home 1.5 million in income and bonuses. But in that time, the intrinsic value of your business has gone from, I don't know, 10 million to 200 million. Well, then, I don't think that's the issue. I don't, and if you do end up selling your business, then I think it behooves you to have some idea of how you're going to share that pot with your long-term, your most loyal employees. So people who've just been there for a year get a little bit, and people who've been there for 20 for the whole journey, they get the big chunk. And having just an understanding of how to share the spoils, I don't think the issue. I don't think in the productivity-based payment model, I don't think that the payment of the owner, or the CEO, I don't think that is relevant. I don't think that's a contentious issue, because the owner should be looking at compounding intrinsic value in the business.
But that compounding intrinsic value, and let's say in the end your liquidity event for the business is you decide to do an ESOP with the employees and everything, but sometimes people go for too much remuneration on the ESOP, and then they burden the employees with
Right. Well, I'm
loan
not a
value,
big
right?
fan of ESOPs,
Okay, that's good. I didn't know that.
because I'm transferring too much risk
Right.
to people who may not be.
It's a financial burden for you to get paid out more, so you'd have to take a lesser amount. Like it gets too convoluted, I
It
think.
does.
It's a tricky problem. But related to the ESOPs, like one of the parts it's talked about in books, and I'll come back to books because Shannon brought up today is one, you're feeling slightly under the weather, and so really missed you this morning because one of the things Shannon brought up was books and what's our favorite books and sharing that amongst it. And I know you're deep level books. And I'm like, oh, Steven's not here to hear all these book recommendations. I know you'd have them, beautifully delivered to your doorstep, as we talked about from a local bookshop. But we have talked about one of our favorite books is Small Giants, and they talk about ESOPs and Small Giants.
They do, and I have it's a continuing part of the conversation. I just don't think I think that shifting the burden of responsibility from the ESOP trust from the owner to the ESOP trust, effectively saddling your previous workforce with the debt.
Right.
That just doesn't sit well with
Mm.
me. It doesn't. So a perpetual trust is I think is a much better idea, and not everybody is designed for ownership, and not And once you have an ESOP, even though all the members of the ESOP, there may be individual employees, you've now institutionalized ownership. And I just don't believe in institutional ownership. I don't believe that institutionalized ownership allows for the depth of responsibility and taking responsibility that it's one of those. I just don't think it's an ideal solution.
So once again, we're talking about my love of contradictions, right? And you're saying like the collectivist approach doesn't work, but yet we're at an event called the Collective, and we get to enjoy the hive mind of the collective and these communications and like everything. So it's like, collectivist ideas or a collectivist group can work in one way, but maybe not in another. Or like, how do you think about it? Or what did you enjoy about having a collective group of this, like a coterie of a
Well,
small hive mind?
we're all individuals here.
Mm.
We're all individuals who are voluntarily coming together to enjoy each other's company, to exchange ideas, and then to leave the collective to go back into our individual works and lives. So I think it's one of the proverbs, is it? I don't know, I think it's Proverbs 24:10 or something, is in the multitude of wisdom is in the multitude of counselors, which means that having lots of different opinions allows you to form a better judgment. And this is one of those places where if you come and listen respectfully, people who have entirely different jobs. Some have very short time horizons, sort of in their daily activities. Others have much longer time horizons and making much longer decisions. Others are observers and have an analytical framework that and putting all those together on one table, that's hugely valuable. Yeah. And I do get a twitch whenever I hear collective anything, because I think I think I'm an individualist with a deep understanding that we can only have freedom if we are prepared to take responsibility. And responsibility means exactly that. You can Once you start delegating it, once you start collectivizing responsibility, you end up with a much, much worse outcome. Always.
Well, in this scenario, the responsibility on Shannon. So I want to thank Shannon for putting on this amazing collective event, such an unbelievable location, this unique Nantucket that we've been able to enjoy, and all the unique aesthetics around here. But also, I want to thank you because we've been talking about prosperity, and a lot of our conversations actually over the last week have been around what's value, what's money, especially in a very digital, abstract, postmodern age. And the most valuable thing for me in this entire world is great conversations. And you've given me the value of your time over several hours to have some of the best conversations, and it's given me great joy, and the time passes so quickly. So I
Thank you.
can't thank you enough.
And likewise.
Yeah, appreciate it.